Lotje, Iris, I give the floor to you.
All right.
Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I will start sharing our slides. First of all, welcome today. We're very pleased to be invited to this how do I say it? Agora. Yes, Agora meeting. Really nice to be able to meet all of you and discuss with you the topics of today in the second part of this meeting. I took the liberty of inviting some colleagues from Utrecht University, so you will see some unfamiliar faces today. First of all, let's start by introducing ourselves. Lotje, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks again indeed for the invite. It's great to be here. I'm Lotje Siffels. I am now a PhD candidate at the Radboud University, working on a project about digital good, which is mostly about the digitization of healthcare and also the influence of big tech in healthcare. And before I started at Radboud, I worked with Iris at Utrecht University on DIDA, which is a tool she will explain more about today. I think for now that's enough. Thanks.
All right, so my name is Iris Muis. I still work at Utrecht University within a team called Utrecht Data School. And we research the impact of datafication on society. So we try to really bring that humanities perspective to tech. You know, within that perspective, data ethics is of course very important. So that's one strand of research we are very interested in, and we have focused on for the past 5 years. So, or 6 years even. And when Lotje and I worked together a couple of years ago, data ethics was our joint focus. So today we would really like to share with you our experiences in working with data ethics in external organizations, because we really did a lot of work guiding data ethical sessions. Mostly within government organizations. And, you know, after doing this for a couple of years and within multiple organizations, big organizations, smaller organizations, we started seeing recurring arguments within the ethical debates, patterns, and we would like to share with you some of these recurring themes. And we, in the second part of this this workshop, we would really like to hear, you know, your experiences or opinions about this, and really turn this into a discussion, which could be fruitful for further research. So first of all, what exactly did we do? So we worked with an instrument called the Data Ethics Decision Aid, or DIDA for short, which was created in 2016 by Utrecht Data School to guide organizations or project teams specifically in developing ethical algorithms, ethical data projects in general. So really coming from a public values perspective, this deliberational framework was meant to guide project teams in really operationalizing public values within their specific data projects. So on the slide you see what that looks like. There's a big poster and the project team is standing around this poster. They are answering all sorts of different questions surrounding different topics, which range from technical topics like anonymization, data sources used, access to data and security, to topics such as privacy or bias. So all of these questions you can see there on the poster, and the project team is meant to deliberate with each other about these questions and to really come to decisions about how to best adopt these, you know, different public values within their project design. or algorithm design. So that's just to give you an idea of what it looks like. And for these workshops, which typically take around 3 hours, so quite long, but we really feel that that's necessary for a good ethical reflection. You know, it takes some time to get to the core of things. We really advise project teams to invite people with a range of different backgrounds to these sessions. So people with a background in tech, people with a background in policy development or law, communication even. So to really stimulate different viewpoints being brought into these ethical deliberations. This is the poster, the English version of the poster. I realize the letters are very small, so I don't expect you to be able to read this, but if you want to take a closer look, just let me know and I will put the link to all of the downloads of DIDA in the chats later on. We also, during the past 2 years, started working with an online version, which you can see here. So we would no longer go to organizations, but have these kinds of, you know, Teams meetings with people from municipalities, people from other governmental and even sometimes commercial organizations, in which they could fill out this PDF version of DIDA. And you can see here at step 1, we start out with defining the values of the organization. So here you really see that public values perspective reflected in the design of and the process of DIDA. So, you know, after 5 years of ethical deliberation, what did we gain out of this, and what were the things we saw reflected in almost every workshop? So first of all, just to give you an idea of the scope, we did these kinds of sessions within more than 80 organizations, most of them Dutch organizations, a couple of them German or Belgian organizations, but like 95% was Dutch, most of which were local government institutions, so municipalities. The cases that were brought in were very different, so it could be a more complex project, like a project with image recognition or risk prediction, to more simple projects like combining a couple of different data sets. The project teams were interdisciplinary, people with different backgrounds, and you know, every organization obviously has different organizational values, which also caused a different outcome of each workshop. So, of course, the organizational values are also very much dependent on the political color of the city council when talking about municipalities. So, more liberal municipality has different organizational values than left city council, for instance. But most importantly, we got lots of data out of these ethical deliberations, because for us, DIDA mainly acts as a research tool. Because, as I said before, we're very interested in the impact of datafication on society, and also the impact of the way a city is governed, for instance. So DIDA really gave us an entry point into an organization to have a seat at the table, not as researcher with a survey, for instance, but really as expert or as moderator, which gave us, you know, very valuable insights and very intimate details sometimes of the impact datafication really has within an organization. So here you see really that duality of DIDA. So for the external organization, it's an impact assessment which can guide them into ethically implementing data projects. And for us as researchers, it really acts as a research tool, which gives us insights into the way datafication shapes society. If you have any questions, by the way, feel free to ask them at the end of this session. I would really like to discuss with you also the use of data as a research tool. It's something we're very interested in hearing from you also, how you collect your data and your experiences with these types of instruments. So now we get to the juicy part. What did we observe? And I would like to give the word to Lotje for this.
Thanks, Iris. So yeah, for me, I'm allowed to do the juicy part. It's really nice. So I first want to just briefly discuss some general observations that we made, and then go into the subject that we really want to discuss today, which we called the Zeitgeist narrative. So also just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that we would see and that would already be very interesting. So first of all, there was a huge difference between different kind of organizations in what kind of expertise they had. This expertise, we mean with that technical expertise, but also expertise in the practice of the field. So these would be local government institutions doing data projects about a given thing. For example, how to deal with citizens in debt or how to prevent their citizens from falling into debt. And it would differ greatly what kind of expertise would be at the table at these ethical deliberations. And when there was somebody with expertise from the practice of the field, in this case, somebody who actually spoke with people who were in debt, who knew the practice of it, that would make a huge difference in the ethical deliberation. So it's already interesting that this varied so greatly. But it's also interesting that we could see in the ethical discussion how this changed the ethical discussion. So values like equality, dignity, like the absence of bias, privacy, these are very abstract values when they're just there on a list. But when you have somebody there who knows how these values work in practice, then you can get a real ethical discussion. So this was really necessary for the ethical discussion. And the same goes for the second point. So this is about the more technical expertise, the data literacy of the people involved. And this also differed greatly per government organization that we worked with. But we saw how much of a difference it makes when you have people on the table who know the nitty-gritty of the technical aspects. Because as I guess most of you here will realize, these ethical values, they are ingrained in the nitty-gritty of the technical aspects. And if you don't even know, a simple example is like, if you don't even know what anonymization is or pseudonymization, how are you supposed to talk about these abstract values? And so we saw ethical discussions having being so much more effective if the people with the technical expertise were at the table. But oftentimes this kind of expertise is not there in project teams because it's being outsourced. So not all local government institutions have this expertise within their organizations, and they hire external parties to deal with that part. And we could really see how much of a difference this makes, because this means that, yeah, most of these projects teams couldn't really discuss the ethical aspects of the project they were developing. And most of the time, these external parties, they weren't there for the discussion, right? So the whole part of the ethical decision-making was also outsourced in this case. And this is something that worried us that we could see. But it was very interesting also to see how it works. And this also has to do with the third point, that when there is a lack of either kinds of these expertise, like the practical or the technical, then yeah, you run the risk of having responsibility gaps. If people don't really know how it works, when you ask them, well, who is responsible for this aspect, or who is responsible when something goes wrong? What will you do when something goes wrong? They won't know. And especially, this is of course specifically for data projects a very prominent thing, because people don't really understand where the decision making even lies when there's all these technical things involved, or when there's an external party involved. So this was also something we saw quite regularly, and that was dependent on the kind of expertise at the table. But a more positive note, the fourth thing, is that we also noticed that civil servants are really good at having ethical discussions. They are well equipped to talk about the common good. So there is something in our structure of our local governance where this works out well. These civil servants, they are very good at articulating values and also thinking about the common good for their citizens. We know this also because we were able to compare it with doing these workshops with some commercial organizations. And this was a big difference. Mostly the participants from commercial organizations, they were not used to thinking about the public good or public values at all. So we suddenly noticed that we had to start at a whole different level of having an ethical discussion. And then the fifth point, which gets a bit more to what I will discuss after this a bit more elaborately. One of the things we really noticed is that when ethics became a box to be ticked, it loses its value. And what we mean is that we noticed a big difference between workshops where participants, usually out of their own interest for the ethical aspects of the project, would want to do a kind of ethical deliberative process and ethical assessment, and the workshops where the municipality had obliged them to do an ethical assessment. So they had to just tick this box of, yeah, we did an ethical assessment. If that was the mindset of the participants, then you cannot really have an ethical discussion. They just want to be done with it. And then finally, the thing I will go into deeper now is the Zeitgeist apology. So the Zeitgeist narrative or apology, so we call it an apology when it's used within within the discussion as kind of a justification for doing a project without really thinking about the ethical considerations. What we mean with that is anytime we notice that participants said things like these, we just have to get through it. You just need to do this. Everybody does it. One participant during one of the workshops actually called data projects toys for the boys, which I thought was very interesting. I will go into it later a bit deeper. But they also sometimes called it a system jump. And what they mean is like it is required to just make this switch, to go on into this new system, this new future that there is. And it will happen anyway, and it needs to happen anyway. So why think about it too much? Or all these ethical considerations are then not taken seriously. So it is really about anytime a participant did not seriously enter into the ethical discussion because they thought something like a data project was inevitable because of progress. This was the future, and you cannot deny the future that is coming anyway. And more than that, it is also bad to try to prevent this future from happening, because they really see technological advancements in the form of these data projects as a high-speed train that is going really fast, and you have to get on it because otherwise you miss it and you're left behind. And this is then one of the worst things that could happen. Now, why did we think this was so interesting? Well, it's because this Zeitgeist narrative, it has a huge, maybe even bigger than the initial observations that I mentioned, influence on the quality of the ethical discussion we had with these participants. And this is because of a couple of reasons, a couple of characteristics of this narrative. So again, as I said, progress is seen as an inevitability, which of course it makes you a bit, it makes no sense to really carefully consider something that's inevitable anyway. But also valuing innovation, so this progress and innovation in itself is just put like on a higher level than the other values. And like I said, these civil servants are pretty well equipped to think about public values and also to recognize like there's a plurality of values, and we want to consider them. We do not want to place one on top of the other. But then when it was about innovation or progress, or this idea of trying not to miss the train, this was really forgotten. And it was like you could use the argument of innovation to trump any other value that was relevant in the project. So innovation is a way to temporarily waive other ethical consideration. And then the third point is that it invokes a sense of haste, which also, of course, is in the way of having a careful process where you think about ethical values. Like Ida said, you need a long time to do it, and a lot of things will come out that will slow down the project. And this doesn't fit with this feeling of haste that this Zeitgeist narrative invokes. You have to get on it now, otherwise we will be left behind. And then the fourth point is, I guess, for us, this was the most important one, that it invokes this sense of powerlessness. And this is because, participants, they would sometimes really be downcast during these workshops, because they would be just like, well, it's going to happen anyway. What are we doing here? And they felt so powerless because sometimes they were actually interested in the public values, and they were interested in all the ethical aspects, and they were worried, and they had all these great insights about possible problems with these data projects, but they just felt like they were powerless to stop the advancement of these data projects. And so this also leads to another aspect, that is that sometimes the participants, so the civil servants themselves, were really thinking in this Zeitgeist narrative, and they weren't very critical about them, but sometimes they were very critical about it. And it wasn't really that they themselves felt like progress was this train they had to get on, but they knew that the politicians that at that moment were determining which projects needed to be developed, that those were thinking along those lines. So they felt like, we can be here thinking about all the ethical aspects, and we can even tell them that this is problematic, but they won't listen anyway. They will want to do it anyway. They will want to get on this train. And this is some of the participants, they mentioned things like this. And usually this was like way at the end of the workshop. So after having a 2-3 hour discussion about all the relevant ethical aspects, a really rich discussion. And then at the end, one of the participants would say like, but it's going to happen anyway. And then if you ask why is it going to happen, and they say, well, it's to score politically. The political image is the municipality's number one priority. So they want to score with data projects. And another said, this is another quote, like, an ethical dilemma is the output of the project. So all the ethical considerations that we had discussed for 3 hours at a time versus just the eagerness to start the project. So this eagerness is just trumping all the careful considerations that you could have about these. So for us, it was really the sense of powerlessness that we could find, we could see, and we saw how pernicious it was, because it just precluded all the ethical considerations that were being discussed. And also, and this is why I put the second sentence here, it is not just the ethical deliberation, but it also does something pernicious to the relationship between the civil servant and their citizens. And this is also something interesting. So with data projects, more than we think with other projects, civil servants will have an urge to think like, but people will get angry about this anyway because they're data projects. And civil society will get angry about it anyway because they're data projects. But we have to get through it, like we have to do it still, because otherwise we will miss this train. So this whole idea of that public opinion, that there may be a richness to a democratic process that the civil servants were actually usually very aware of. In the case of data projects, sometimes this was just gone. And this also leads to the final thing that I wanted to say about this, because we want to leave a lot of room for discussion. But we haven't really worked out yet what kind of conceptual frameworks we could use to think about this. I mean, we called it a Zeitgeist narrative or apology because that's it resonated with what we felt and saw. But there's of course a lot of ways that this has been noticed before by other scholars. But linking to this preclusion also of the democratic aspects of these, the consequence it has for thinking about democracy and about relationship between the civil servants and the citizens, is that it's a kind of technocratic way of thinking. So it gets you out of thinking about democratic values and gets you into, but the system will know what's best, and we know what's best because this is progress. So we know better than our citizens what's best. So it doesn't matter whether they get angry, because there's no sense anymore that there's value in the democratic process itself. So it's kind of technocratic way of thinking. And I just want to briefly highlight, because I don't have time to explain the difficult frameworks of, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Boltanski and Thévenot or Boltanski and Chiapello, but I've been working with these frameworks, and it really shows how for civil servants that are usually discussing things among themselves in a kind of civic logic, which is for them very relevant. So it's about democratic values, about processes of democracy, it's about rights, equality. But when it's about data projects, suddenly this logic shifts to a different kind of logic, which you could call an industrial or project logic, which is mostly about efficiency. It's about expertise, but in a very technical sense. And it's also about innovation and also disruption. So disrupting traditional old-fashioned ways of doing things to create something new. And again, this goes at the cost of a democratic logic. But I also like to connect it to this work from Vinsel and Russell that you may know, which is called the innovation delusion, which is about saying they really show that it's also in our point of time in certain societies where innovation as a value is just highly valued, more highly valued than other values, and specifically the values that are opposite to innovation, which would be maintenance, maintenance work, care work. So anything that works more on the background to keep things going, but isn't disrupting. It's actually enabling society to run. So think about maintaining bridges, roads, but also, of course, care work, healthcare work. These are things that we value a lot less in our societies, and even we sometimes make them very invisible. Cleaning jobs are always done at night or early in the morning, so you don't see it. And innovation, that's something we always make it very visible, we show it. And there's also a gender dimension to this, which I think is interesting, but I'm just curious to hear what you think about it. But there's definitely this idea that there's something about innovation, which is exploring, discovering, like these thoughts of frontier and breaking the frontier, and this is valued, and it's also stereotypically a bit of they're a bit of male values, at least stereotypically in our society, whereas care, cleaning, maintenance, they are stereotypically seen as female values, and therefore they're also seen as less valuable. And finally, but definitely not least, it really resonates with Evgeny Morozov's idea of technolutionism. Sorry, I just now realized that there are more Evgenys working on this than just one. But so what we really saw is that the civil servants, they are not really led by a problem when they're trying to do these data projects. Not always, sometimes they are, but oftentimes it's not the problem that's the thing. They just want to do the data project and they try to find any kind of problem or even make one up in order to be able to do the data project. So it's solution led. They first have the solution, they just need to find a problem that they could stick to it. And that's, of course, leads to all kinds of problematic aspects. So these are just quite random thoughts, and I'm just to hope that in the discussion you can help us along in thinking about this. So I think we're going to do future outlooks. So I'll keep this brief because I'm not sure. So we have seen, of course, over the years, things changing as well by doing these workshops for so long. And Iris will have more to say about it because she's been doing it for even longer. I've been out of it for 2 years. But I think there is some hopeful messages. So I think we do see also in the public debate about this, but also within these workshops, there is more and more attention for the democratic character of ethical deliberation. So there's more and more criticism on having just a list of values and not really doing anything with it, not really doing anything deliberative or democratic with these values. And I think that's a good thing. We need this kind of a shift. And I also think that we do get more critical of this idea of innovation being the only important value. And we do get more critical of techno-solutionist thinking. You may notice this is also just what I hope will be the direction that we are heading. But I think there is some reason to be a bit optimistic there. But the third point, which is not so optimistic, is that I think specifically also when looking at government institutions, there's still a large dependence on external parties. And it depends very much on the kind of project that you're having, what kind of parties they are. But they have quite a lot of power when it comes to data projects and also when it comes to public policy as data projects. And this is quite worrisome. So there still isn't a lot of I still think there isn't enough initiative on public institutions themselves to start developing the expertise needed to really keep data projects in the democratic system. And this, of course, also goes on a different level when we look at big tech, who are also still increasingly getting much more and more powerful within these kinds of projects. I did some research into Corona apps on a European level, and of course, this is a very clear example where big tech had such a big say in our ethical discussion about what these technologies should look like. So a bit of positive and a bit of negative, and now I hope Iris will make it even more positive than I did. Yeah.
Well, let's see. Thanks, Lotje. So I've really noticed a very big shift in the sense of urgency surrounding digital ethics. So when we started at Utrecht Data School, getting interested into data ethics, which was around 2015, really no one was talking about this. We even did a small research into how many times the forthcoming GDPR was mentioned in the media. Zero times up until like the last 2 months it was actually getting into effect in 2018. So it really shows the lack of awareness surrounding these topics. And the past couple of years, I've really seen a very high rise in the attention given to data ethics. So there are a lot of new frameworks being released, guidance instruments, guidelines, codes of conduct, especially in the past year or so, like 1.5 years. So I feel like that's a very positive thing. There's also an EU regulation forthcoming about AI. So I'm just very curious to see what its final form will be. And it really changes the character of doing data ethics from being up until now purely voluntarily or mostly to being a bit more obligatory. So I also feel like that's a good thing, because now doing data ethics is largely dependent on individuals within organizations that have an intrinsic motivation in talking about these subjects. Sorry, let me take a sip of water. So the character of data ethics will really shift in the future. I think it will be very challenging to codify ethics, because of course ethics as opposed to law is a very gray area, which is not really it's very hard to put it into print and to codify it. So instead, I feel like demanding proof or documentation of an elaborate ethical deliberation will be more successful. So really, instead of demanding complete adherence to the law, demanding elaborate documentation and showing that you have carefully considered ethical considerations within your process. So that's just my opinion. I'm interested in hearing your opinion in a minute. Something else I wanted to talk about is that there is a new impact assessment, which is the Fundamental Rights and Algorithms Impact Assessment, which was created by the Utrecht University last year. I was one of the co-developers of this impact assessment, which I think will play an important role, especially in the Dutch context, because this impact assessment is one of the options when impact assessments are made obligatory by this EU regulation. So it's one of the options for the Dutch context, at least. So it is available in Dutch, but it will be available in English, I hope, this month. And I will definitely make sure to share the link with Yevgeny if you're interested. And this is really also focused on that facilitating facilitating the documentation of ethical deliberation. So really focused on creating that proof of a careful decision-making process when it comes to ethical aspects. So we would really like to hear your opinion on this. I've written down some, starting questions on this slide, but just feel free to weigh in on whatever subject we have talked about today. Let's open the floor up for some discussion. I would really love to hear some reactions of you.
Thank you so much, Lotje and Iris. Fascinating insights. So indeed, let's open up the floor for questions and discussion. So please feel free to use the raise your hand function or send in into chat, but preferably just use the raise your hand function so that we can have a chat in live format. I did see there was one question that came in the chat earlier from Nishant. Nishant, would you like to ask your question yourself?
Sorry, I've missed that question.
Otherwise, yeah. I can read it. So Nishant was saying, I'm sorry if I missed this, but I have a question. What kind of infrastructure were these projects using? For example, compute for data processing, storage, machine learning, etc.
So I'm guessing the question is about what cases were typically brought in for this DIDA instrument. So this really varied a great deal. So sometimes a case was brought forth surrounding an algorithm to predict which citizens were likely to get into debt. For instance, this algorithm could be developed by an external party or could be developed in-house. Another example is, this is of course like a risk assessment model, and these were very prominent within the cases that were brought forth. But we also encountered more simple data projects. So it really depended completely. Every workshop had a different case being discussed. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks. And next we have Madeleine. Yes.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, my computer's a little funny. Yeah, thanks so much for your talk. It was so interesting. I was especially interested in this Zeitgeist narrative. I work in the ethics and philosophy section at the university and work with engineers as well. And I've heard this a lot in both the philosophy section and with the engineers as well. And I was just wondering, how often you hear explicit concern about funding. So we have to keep up because funding, that's how we'll keep funded, or I guess I'm just wondering how money plays a role in the Zeitgeist narrative, and if it does explicitly, which I think you sort of allude to in the references you were talking about. And yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, it's actually a good question, I think. So I feel like with the workshops we did with these local government institutions, it doesn't explicitly seem like funding was a very big aspect of it. It was more like the political interest and the political image that could be created with these data projects. That seemed like a big influence. But please, Iris, say so if it was different. I also just wanted to briefly mention that because I'm currently also looking at the influence of big tech in healthcare, and there it's very clearly present. So when you ask medical researchers why they want to collaborate with big tech, they just say there is no public funding for these kinds of projects. Because usually these data projects are long-term research projects, and they just say that there's no public money, so we have to, and it's of course a very worrying answer. Yeah, so I think it might be relevant here as well, but much less explicitly. Yeah.
Is anything you want to add to that, or?
No,
Sure.
I completely agree. So municipalities have a set budget for things like social services, and when they deploy an algorithm or some other type of data project within the domain of social services, it comes out of that budget. So typically, it's not something that's really being made explicit, funding within these types of ethical deliberation, but I really think that's due to the structure of the municipal organization and the budgeting. Yeah, but very interesting, Lotje, to hear the very big difference between what you've encountered within healthcare. Yeah. Katelijn, you have a question, I see.
Yeah, thank you very much also for the interesting presentations and documentation that you provided. I'm really quite interested in what you do with DIDA. And I see so publications coming up, and you have an interesting website on it as well. So what do you see as the next step in this platform? What would you like to enhance over time?
In DIDA, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm actually working on an update right now. So we aim to bring out an update every year due to technological developments, things we encounter during workshops, changing laws and regulations surrounding the topic. So that's something we take into consideration. And for this new impact assessment that we just brought out, the IAMA, we did that because we felt a need that there was for more focus on human rights. So this impact assessment therefore focuses heavily on human rights, fundamental rights, and also it narrows the scope from data projects in general to algorithms in particular. Because the need is changing. The use of algorithms that could potentially breach human rights is increasing. So that's a shift we've encountered.
So is this like an ongoing collaboration between Radboud and Utrecht?
Lotje?
Well, no, it's not. So the basis for this, I mean, we're still thinking of ideas together and collaborating, but it's kind of what I'm doing at Radboud is kind of a different project. So it's just I used to work at Utrecht and now I work at Radboud, but of course the issues are very similar sometimes, and there's very interesting. So we collaborate and exchange ideas. Yeah, but it's not the project at Radboud is a different project. Yeah, on a similar topic.
Okay, thank you.
But of course, we hope it's an ongoing collaboration. Yeah.
Yes. So do we? No. Yes, please go ahead.
Hi. Thanks, Iris and Lotje, for the fascinating insights. I was going to ask you. You're talking now with engineers. All of us, I think. Most of us have a background in engineering. Not all of us, but I think all of us are in this AiTech community, really to build bridges, but also to see how we can transform the culture and practice of engineering. So I was wondering, based on your insights, because there was I think some really great granular insight into engineering culture, or more particularly, I think cultures of techno-solutionism that are mostly, I think, inhabited or also persist through engineers taking on these roles in these spaces. So I was wondering if you have any advice or any ideas about what we can take away or what we could do based on these insights. Of course, I have my own, but I was curious to see if you have any ideas for how we could train and engage with the next generation of engineers, computer scientists, to steer away from this culture and work towards other practices.
It's such a good and also big question. Yeah, no, it's so for me, but it's also because that, as you also saw, and which is also ingrained in this Zeitgeist narrative, one of the really important things is that we need to, just develop systems of recognizing when this narrative is there, or when we are thinking more in a techno-solutionist way than in an actual, constructive ethical deliberation. And I feel like, we're getting, I do think we're getting better at that, but we still need a bit of, just kind of recognizing it, so that we see like, oh, it seems like we really want this solution, and we're not really thinking carefully about whether this problem that we're trying to stick to it is really a problem, is really something that needs to be solved in this way, or maybe a much more complex problem, or maybe that we're creating more problems as we're trying to fit this solution to it. So we need systems of thinking about this. And I think actually, so this is also the work that the Utrecht Data School is doing, is also always re-evaluating the kind of pretty practical tools that are there, but they are tools to open up deliberation. So you always have to think about how do we keep the process deliberative, how do we keep thinking about the democratic values involved in there. And I feel like that's really the key, because if you, this is the thing with ethics, of course, it changes, and that's its essence. It should be allowed to change, and any kind of thing that tries to pin it down too hard or actually tries to preclude any kind of ethical deliberation is dangerous. So these are for me like the fundamental conditions that we need for ethics, that they're mostly democratic values, because those think about how to make them transparent, how to allow ethics to also keep changing. And I think engineers are getting better at thinking about this, but they have like a really big responsibility, because they know the details, right? And this is, I mean, this is why what you're doing, of course, is great, because in order to think about the ethics, and this is why I also showed you like how much we noticed, how much of difference it makes when you have the people who are good at thinking about public value together with the people who know how the technology works. That's really the only way to think about it ethically. If you miss one of the two, it's not really working. But I'm also interested in your ideas.
Yeah,
about it.
Definitely. And to add something super concrete to what you were saying, Lotje. So to give one example of how we deal with this is we have a master program, Applied Data Science, and we have now started to integrate an weekly ethics colloquium within that program. So it's a mandatory colloquium for all of the data students. And every week we either invite someone from the field to talk about, like a data scientist, to talk about how he or she deals with data ethics. This week I am giving a session there with DIDA, so with the data ethics decision aid, to really teach the students to have these deliberational processes surrounding ethics. Yeah, but what is your view on this, Roel?
Well, first, thanks of all for I think there's really tangible things. So you're talking a lot about systems of thinking and reflecting on the problem, the stakes, the different perspectives, and staying open to new forms of ethical deliberation. So like also reflecting on the practices of deliberation and the tools that you're using. And then I heard a few more things, but hopefully we're all taking notes. So I think, first of all, thank you for that. Well, I think, indeed, we are, at least here in Delft, trying to create a more and more community and more ways for other researchers and students to engage. But I think we can learn a lot from what you're doing. And yeah, I think we're ready. So personally, I chose to come to Delft and to work in the technology policy and management faculty, because it's kind of just this rich collection of different disciplines that's also then translated to the curriculum. And so I think within Delft we can learn from that. We can also learn from our colleagues in industrial design engineering that have a similar kind of makeup. So there's a lot of, I think, quick wins, and then also I think inspiration we can draw from the kinds of programs and tools that you're developing. So those are my immediate kind of more pragmatic thoughts. Yeah, not much to add. I think it's excellent. And well, I think one key thing that we still lack, and this is where I spent some of my research, is trying to work towards ways to imagine new ways of designing data-driven functionality, algorithmic functionality. So I think if you stay stuck on the one end, the very practical nuts and bolts, and on the other end, the more like kind of ambiguous values, like there's still like a big gap there, and like how do you fill that with like ways of thinking, how to bridge that also in a material way. So some of the work we're doing is like, what are the kind of typical socio-technical dimensions that keep coming back when you look at a system once it's integrated in a context. So what are the kinds of things you have to take into account when you're designing these systems, both materially kind of, but also in terms of how you manage them. But that's really ongoing work. So it would be great actually to kind of bring that perspective together with what you're doing and see how it could kind of complement and feed on each other.
I so wanted to add to that that I think that on the other, okay, our cat also wants to be part of the conversation. So come here. So that something that I observe is that you know, often how we frame projects, that we start from saying we want to use algorithms or AI to solve societal challenge X. And that's kind of how the project starts. And this is what I often find problematic because, for example, what you talked about today, that is often on my mind. And I find, but that leaves very little wiggle room to even raise the question, but hang on. So the societal challenge we want to solve, that great. But if we enter the project with the framing that the solution involves algorithms and AI, how can we even question that maybe the solution does not involve algorithms or AI, or maybe it might involve them, but in a very different way and narrative from, you know, what is being raised at the beginning. Well, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're completely right, and it's also one of the things that interests me about these kinds of projects. It's indeed the So like you can sense that it's more solution driven than problem driven, and then also the problems that they're trying to address are really big and complex and need care in order to think about them and to develop solutions about them. But this is indeed something that we've noticed, and I'm still noticing also with different projects that it's technology led. So this whole there's still just this way that we worship new technology in progress, and I feel that that's really connected to this, because then you have this technical solution, and that's what you're actually starting from in your thinking process. And I think you're right. So it precludes a good ethical deliberation. And I also think that there's something interesting in this is also why I emphasized haste, because I think that's also there in this way of thinking. It's always about doing things very fast, whereas I think inherently in ethical deliberation and democratic processes in general, they need to be slow. They need to be slow, right? Because you can only do it by thinking about it with a lot of people, letting it pass through a lot of institutions, having all these moments where it's slowed down and reviewed again. So there's an inherent tension there that we need to be wary of, or maybe we need to, that this is also why I like that idea of maintenance work, because these Vincent and Russell, they're really thinking about, okay, so let's start worshiping maintenance instead of innovation. And you could also do this with slowness, like let's worship very slow bureaucratic processes. Let's enjoy them. And that's not something we have scripts for how to do that now, but if we develop those, that could help. Don't know if that kind of resonates, but exactly
and also thanks, Lotje, and also to echo some of the things that you were now talking about with Roel. Personally, I also think that a lot of the things that we need to do on this front lie in the education realm. So because looking back, for example, at my journey, I see that there's a lot of socio-technical gaps and systemic gaps in terms of, how I was educated from my technical background to think about problems. That is very like, well, you solve that in today's challenges, basically, that I think there is so much we can do in the way we train the future generations of specialists, that they think systemically and they realize it's a puzzle that you solve together with other disciplines. And I think so indeed, like Roel was saying, I think we can really learn from each other about the things we're trying and experimenting in education in our different institutions.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So unfortunately, we ran out of time. So I think we could continue talking about this for much longer. I want to, Lotje and Iris, I want to thank you both very, very much for coming today and sharing your insights. And I hope we can continue this conversation another time. And of course, it will be great if people would like to reach out to each other and talk more offline.
Yeah,
Definitely.
great. Sounds good.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invite, and maybe hopefully speak to you again, all of you.
I guess so. We'll talk again at some point. Great.
Definitely.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
so much.
very much for joining today. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.